Grüezi Amerika, Views from the Sister Republic, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brüwiler. Grüezi miteinander and welcome to a new episode of Views from the Sister Republic. A couple of episodes ago, Professor Stefan Schmid introduced us to the history of the referendum in the United States and how it was inspired by the Swiss experience with direct democracy. Ideas travel, but people do too. And this is the topic of this episode. Since the early 18th century, an estimated 300,000 Swiss people emigrated to the US. More than 1 million Americans have Swiss roots. And that's nowhere more visible so than in a small town in the Midwest, New Glarus, Wisconsin. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with someone who works to preserve these roots and help people explore their own ties with Switzerland. Becca Stauffacher. Welcome to Grüezi Amerika, Becca.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Becca, you are a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. You have long worked as an archaeologist before moving into the field of tourism. And now you're combining your different fields of expertise in a way as the president and CEO of the Swiss Center of North America, which is located in New Glarus. What does the Swiss Center do, actually?
So the Swiss Center's goal is to preserve, educate, and celebrate the stories of the Swiss in America and in Canada. So we have a museum in New Glarus that displays historical artifacts, and we have archives, records, photographs, and meeting space for educational classes and conferences and events. Essentially, we want to keep the stories alive. We don't want them to be lost to the generations.
And your name already betrays that you have Swiss roots too, is that right?
Yes, yep, definitely. My family came to Greene County, that New Glarus is in, back in 1867. My great-great-grandfather, Abraham, trained as a blacksmith in Switzerland and came here, worked as a cheesemaker, and then bought a farm where he raised dairy cows and had a blacksmith shop.
That's a very Swiss endeavor. Raise cows. So normally I ask people about their first US experience, which is futile in your case. But I'd like to ask you whether you have been to Switzerland and whether there's an anecdote you could share that you consider typically Swiss.
Yeah, most recently I was in Switzerland in October of 2024, and I was going through a passport control at Zurich Airport, and the clerk had to double check and triple check my passport. He was sure that I was in the wrong line because Stauffacher is not an American name. He just said over and over, and he finally let me through, so it was okay.
Yeah, so Stauffacher is, very American if we're considering that more than 1 million Americans have Swiss roots, but it does, of course, remind us very much of this part of the world. And that's the fun thing about New Glarus. You encounter lots of people with these names that sound very familiar. Could you give us a brief history of how the Swiss ended up in Greene County and ended up founding New Glarus?
So it's kind of a crazy story, actually. The 1840s in Switzerland was not a good decade. It was year after year of poor crops and not enough jobs. And it got bad enough that Canton of Glarus created the Glarus Emigration Society in 1844. And the society offered loans to help residents buy land in America. And in Glarus, there were 193 people who decided to emigrate. Men, women, children, 193 people. So the Emigration Society sent Nicholas Durst and Fridolin Streif to search for suitable land in America. And they ended up purchasing 1,200 acres for $1.25 an acre in what would become New Glarus in 1845 in July. And they decided that they would build cabins and prepare for the rest of the party to arrive the next spring. They had 6-8 months to get ready. But the rest of the settlers back in Glarus were so anxious to begin that they left Switzerland not long after Durst and Strife and essentially chased them across North America, trying to catch up with them. And this is before email and phone, and I don't know how they figured out where they were going next, but they figured it out. They tracked them down. They came to New Glarus in August of 1845. So only, days, a couple weeks after Durst and Strife had bought the land, there's 130 settlers made it here in the final count. There were no cabins built. There were no preparations, but they were just so excited to start and to be here. I think of the original settlers who left Switzerland, I think 8 died on the way. And the rest, the other 40-some, decided to stay and settle in other places along the way. But we ended up with 131, I think, in New Glarus finally. And they had a lot of work to do since nothing was ready. But they grew wheat at first. And when the wheat market dropped out in the 1850s, that's when they turned to dairy. And Wisconsin is known as the dairy state, cheese making, and they were well equipped to do that. So that's what we settled in it as.
So how did the little town fare economically? We know from other settlements by the Swiss, for instance, in the Carolinas, we have New Bern, that the start was very hard. You've outlined already that they found the best trade to focus on with raising cattle for dairy. But how well were they doing in general? How well did the town develop?
I think those first 15 years maybe were pretty tough. Which is normal for people coming to a new place and starting from scratch. I think it was pretty frustrating when they first grew wheat. That was a cash crop. It was great. You could eat it and you could sell it. But as the West expanded in America, states like Kansas and Iowa were able to grow wheat on a much larger scale. And they just, here in Wisconsin, we couldn't compete. And I think there probably was a little bit of, I wouldn't say panic, but, uncertainty before they figured out that dairy and cheese making could really be what they do. There were some real hard winters for sure, where the first few, there were a lot of families in single houses, all squashed together. But after a little bit, they really came into their own. It was a very a well-off little community.
What I found very interesting when I visited New Glarus myself and had a look at the little museum was how well they maintained their ties with the motherland, so to speak, with Glarus itself. How typical is that of immigrant settlements in the U.S., that they kept such close ties with their home country?
I think it's not unusual. It wasn't necessarily happening everywhere, but especially when you had a settlement like this where everybody came from the same very small area, it was much more normal. It wasn't long after the settlers got here that there was a terrible avalanche in Glarus, and the settlers sent back for them what was quite a bit of money in aid and in assistance. I think there was a fire too in Glarus. The settlers here sent back assistance. And it went both ways. There's still quite a lot of back and forth between Glarus and New Glarus. Visitors, special relationships. Our fire departments are very close and visit each other every couple years. It's really nice to see that those ties are sustained.
Ties are also expressed through, shared cultural habits, but also language. I found it interesting how long New Glarus kept its newspaper in German, actually. But I didn't hear that much German anymore in present day New Glarus. So how alive is Schweizerdeutsch still in New Glarus? I saw the bench saying, "Do you speak Schweizerdeutsch?" But I didn't hear it actually.
There's not a lot of it left, no. And the people who do still speak it tend to be an older generation. It's not spoken in the home anymore. Like even, say, my dad's generation, he heard Swiss around the farm. His parents or other people in the community were still speaking it fairly regularly. So maybe he wasn't fluent, but he understood enough. But, my generation, most of us, our parents were not speaking it at all. So it is disappearing quickly.
But so how is your generation still trying to keep the ties with your home country? I mean, for you, it comes with your job, of course, but outside of the community of people who are really working for the Swiss heritage, how are they trying to keep the Swiss heritage alive?
So there's a lot of people in New Glarus who maybe are my generation, and even though they don't speak the language anymore, there's still a lot of pride about being Swiss, being from Glarus, who you're related to. People still go back several generations to talk about who was cousins with who. But in a more a tangible and everyday way, it sounds bad. It's been commercialized a little bit, and that makes it a little bit more accessible to people who maybe don't have the depth of history in their family stories. Or New Glarus especially tapped into, in the 1960s, there was a cultural heritage tourism movement in Wisconsin that was actually pushed out by the state government. They gave support for this, and it was a way to preserve and also promote the different cultural heritages around Wisconsin, because there's not just Swiss, there's Norwegian and German, Irish, and there's tons of different cultures here. And they could see even in the 1960s that those were disappearing, and they were like, well, how do we preserve this? And each community that participated did it in a different way. But in New Glarus, they chose to really focus on tourism, and they added Swiss architecture to a lot of the commercial buildings in town to make it feel and look more Swiss, which is kind of funny because the original settlers did not build that way. They came to America and they wanted to be American in a lot of ways. It was kind of important to fit in and show that you were modern and successful. But with this cultural tourism push, the buildings became Swissified, and people were already eating Swiss food here and playing Swiss music, but it became more accessible for outsiders. There were more restaurants, there were more festivals that people could participate in. And so that's what you still see today. We have, for a town of 2,000, we've got half a dozen festivals that feature Swiss cultural pieces in them. We have a yodeler club and a manor corps. We have flag throwing and Alp horns, and it's very visible and it's very evident. So I think that to an outsider, it's kind of a glossy veneer, but to the people who live here, they really do feel that this is a tie and a connection and a way of carrying on their heritage.
That's an interesting development that you have. On the one side, you have a push by the state itself that people should be more mindful of their cultural heritage, of their roots. And then you have this choice to commercialize, as you said it. It's a very American approach at the end of the day. It's not a dirty word in that sense. But then that this also leads to genuine feelings of identification or reinforces what has already been there. And I find it very interesting what you mentioned about the architecture, because if you walk through New Glarus as a Swiss, you feel that it's an interesting mixture of different Swiss styles. It's not coherent. It's not how Glarus would look like. But you have a chalet of the Golden Fleece, and you have really nice, what the Germans would call Fachwerk. We call it Riegelbau. Do you know anything about how this mixture came about? Was it just individual ideas that were combined?
So in the beginning, I think it was really whoever owned the building, it was whatever they felt was appropriate. And so if they had a particular, if they're from Bern, maybe there'd be Bernese features. In more recent years, in maybe the 1990s, the village actually codified it. And so now it's actually in our village ordinances that if you're a commercial building in a certain area, you're required to have Swiss architectural features. And they even have a little, like a playbook of ideas of what fits into that vision. And it is a bit of a mishmash. It's not just from one area. It's more what are the touchstones of what the public recognizes as Swiss. So the wide, low roofs and window boxes, and it's pretty interesting to look at.
Is there also an ordinance regarding what kind of business you can run? Because it's really interesting how, well, you have a Swiss restaurant and you have a bakery that even says Leckerli, which you wouldn't necessarily buy in Glarus. That's more a Basel thing, but it's still fun to discover that. But are there any endeavors by the town to make sure that the Swissness is also really reflected in the commerce in the town?
There's not at the moment, no. So New Glarus is a nice small town, even without the Swiss aspect of it. We've got an amazing brewery and a winery and bike trails and a state forest, but the Swissness is what adds the uniqueness to the town, and it's kind of what makes its New Glarus stand out from other quaint little towns that are pretty similar. And so I think that a lot of the merchants and business owners recognize that, and they know what tourists and visitors want, and so they really try and serve that. There are a lot of Swiss restaurants and shops. We've lost a couple of the Swiss, retail shops in recent years, but even the stores that aren't specifically selling Swiss merchandise will have something in there because people want it.
To what extent are the young residents of New Glarus interested in the heritage? And to what extent do they just feel that this is something very uncool that their grandparents care about?
I think it's a mix, for sure. A lot of it depends on your family. If your family is active in activities, then the kids are more likely to be. But I think that we're doing pretty well. We have a kinderchor that is quite robust. I mean, there's 40 kids in that probably, at least, and they learn traditional Swiss songs and they perform a few times in the summer. It's adorable. Our high school has flag throwing classes that kids can take. There's also an Alphorn group at our high school that has performed on a state level. So it's definitely there. If kids have any interest, there are programs available to them. But I'm sure a lot of them also get pushed into it by their parents. But that's how it always is. So
that's true. Yeah,
I don't worry about that.
This anyway sounds a lot more Swiss than a Swiss high school. We don't have an Alphorn club in my town's high schools. But you're also concerned with Swissness beyond New Glarus. So the Swiss Center of North America also cares about the heritage of the Swiss in North America in general. So not just the US, but also in Canada. So can you tell us a bit about what your day-to-day work for Swissness in America entails?
So a lot of our goal is trying to identify items or stories before they disappear. One of the big issues that we're seeing at the Swiss Center is just every year there's more and more need for preservation of items, of costumes, of letters, because the kids of the people who own these things aren't as interested in the stories as they used to be, or they don't have the storage space, or the stories were never shared with them, so they're not even sure what the stuff is. And so I talk to people very regularly who the story is always the same. They're just like, I don't know what to do with this, but I don't want it to be lost. And so I have a side story. I think one of my little pet side projects is just how much I enjoy the family stories of the items that come to us, but I also really enjoy how garbled they can become over time. So like, the game of telephone where you whisper something in the person's ear and it goes around and it comes back and it's a completely different story. We recently had a donation of this beautiful piece of cloth. It was from the 1830s. And the family story was that the cloth was hand woven in Switzerland by this woman's great-great-grandmother. And it was carried to America, and it was being saved so that she could make a fancy, beautiful dress someday. And what a great story. What a wonderful thing to save. And so we accepted it, but, the phrase trust but confirm, we wanted an outsider to confirm that this is what she's saying it is. So I contacted an archivist at our state historical society and sent pictures of the fabric and asked for any ideas or info or anything they could help me with. And she went into their archives and she found several very identical pieces. I mean, almost completely identical.
Okay.
And it turns out that the fabric, it was a shawl that had been cut in half and had been, without a doubt, created in Paisley, Scotland. So it was a Scottish shawl. And these shawls were really popular in the 19th century. So they were everywhere in Europe and America. She could have bought it in Switzerland. She could have bought it at the port in France. She could have bought it in Chicago. It doesn't mean that the story is worthless or the item is worthless, but it's really interesting that the way the family remembers it versus what the reality is can be so completely different. I love these stories so much.
They should have gotten suspicious with the pattern, right? I mean, Paisley patterns are quite distinct.
Well, and it's a woven shawl too, so you're not going to make a dress out of a yard of woven fabric like that. It's the kind that would unravel immediately if you cut it. It was fascinating. I really enjoyed it.
What is one of the most valuable objects that you're treasuring at the center?
Valuable in terms of money, we have in our downstairs archives, we have some silver objects, books. We have some iconography from Western Switzerland, I believe. But the funny thing is that stuff is beautiful and we love it. But the stuff that is truly valuable is the stories. So what I get really excited about is when people donate letters or photographs, because that's something that you're never going to see anywhere else. You're not going to buy it in a store. You're not going to know the story from anybody but the family or the object itself. So I think there's a lot more value in those things than in any material object that we have.
Do you have a favorite story?
We have a pair of tiny little wooden clogs that were worn by children in 1853 when they took a ship from France to New Orleans. And they were from, gosh, I don't remember where in Switzerland they were from, but they were immigrants. They came over with their parents, and it's just these tiny little wooden shoes that crossed the ocean, and you could just imagine them clomping on the deck and running around, and they held up. And there's something so evocative about imagining the people who wore those that I like those very much.
I think in general, when we're looking at these emigration stories, they really let us travel in time and let us reimagine certain realities of early settlement life, etc. But there is a tendency for these stories to get lost, which is the value of a place like the Swiss Center of America. At the same time, I'm often struck by how little is really available in terms of written history on the Swiss in America or just Swiss-American relations. As someone who is really diving into Swiss-American history every day, what is one of the research needs you have identified? What do you wish we would do at university?
So I don't know if this is exactly what you're asking, but I just discovered this and I'm still pretty excited about it. There is a program out there called Transcriber, I think. I believe it's a German company. And you can upload scans, PDFs of letters, let's say, that are written in script, so are already so hard to read. And then they're also in whatever dialect. And this program can translate the script into text, and then you can take that text and translate it yourself or in Google Translate or whatever you want. But it is going to revolutionize things for us for sure, because a lot of these letters, we're so excited to have them, but they're nearly illegible. I can read script perfectly fine, but someone's hurried chicken scratchings are very difficult. So I've been playing with that a lot over the last couple of weeks, actually, and we've kind of have a whole new world opening up in front of us as a result.
But I mean, one thing is deciphering everything, and then you just have to actually weave it into a bigger story. And I think that's probably something researchers should spend more time on, really. Thank you so much for taking us down the history lane of New Glarus, but also the broader history of Swiss immigrants to the United States. Is there something, a book, a film, a podcast maybe, that you would recommend our listeners to further dive into these stories and this history?
For New Glarus, there are several books that have been written actually about its history and the settler years, and about Fridolin, Streif and Nicholas Durst. Their journals actually are recorded, and they're pretty interesting to read. Moving so quickly through America, it's not like Wisconsin at that time wasn't the Wild West, but it sure wasn't settled. I mean, there was a lot of adventure there. So I really enjoy reading those. One project that we're doing at the Swiss Center, we just started, it's going to take us several years, is we are cataloging and digitizing everything, our archives. And so it will all be available online, not this year, but in the coming years. And I think that people will enjoy poking through our archives and being able to see really what there is. And I hope that'll open some research doors for people too, to explore further.
Maybe also for St. Gallen students, who knows? So thank you so much for your time, Becca. And thank you to all of those of you who have been listening. We look forward to having you back again among our listeners. And with that, I say auf Wiedersehen.
Rösti America, Views from the Sister Republic, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brüwiler.